ossification. But our main topic, kind of to finish this bone development and ossification off, is bone mineral homeostasis. And so there is a slide in your notes that talks a little bit about this. In the notes, it says that bone minerals that are stored, or minerals that are stored within the bone, are things like calcium, phosphates, as well as sodium, potassium, and some carbonate ions. Now, when we look at this, our discussion today is going to focus on calcium phosphate. So that's our main area we want to be. Now, if we look at this, obviously calcium phosphates are crystals that come together, and we call this hydroxyapatite. So these are hydroxyapatite crystals. These are the most common bone minerals that we refer to when we talk about bone mineralization or ossification. And then this hydroxyapatite or calcium phosphates can be separated into calcium and phosphates. And so we'll talk about what calcium does within the body as well as what phosphates do within the body. Now I will tell you, looking ahead, we're going to talk about phosphates first, and then we'll talk about calcium. When we look at the physiology of what calcium and phosphates separately do within the body, most of the attention will be put on calcium and its function throughout the body. So to start, let's look at phosphates first. So if we break this down, and the reason we look at these phosphates and calcium is because we consume them in our diet. Then they're stored within the bones, so we have this storage or reservoir within the bones. But the way we get them into our bodies, we have to consume them within our diet. So it's very important to have a balanced diet so we can have calcium and phosphates to build strong bone and have enough calcium and phosphates within our body to help regulate different physiological functions, not just in the bone, but elsewhere. So the thing about phosphates, when we look at this, kind of a little chemistry. Has everyone had Chem 1? Most of you have had Chem 1, maybe not. But in Chem 1, we talk about polyatomic ions, right? And you learn about phosphates. Well, in phosphates, in chemistry, we call these inorganic phosphates. And I'm just going to write, and you don't have to remember this inorganic versus organic phosphate for our purposes. I'm just kind of giving you a frame of reference. So an inorganic phosphate is a PO4 -3, correct? And if you remember that polyatomic ion, or maybe even if you don't, it looks like this structurally, right? You have a phosphate that is surrounded by 4 oxygens. One oxygen it has a double bond to, and then 3 other oxygens have a negative charge to it. We're not going to get into the detail to how all of this happens, but this is your inorganic phosphate. If you take this inorganic phosphate and you take this oxygen, and this oxygen over here on our left bonds to another molecule like calcium or a carbon or what have you, it will become what's called an organic phosphate. Now, this organic phosphate is a PO4 -2. So the only difference here is this phosphate is now bonded to another molecule. And instead of this third oxygen having a negative charge over here, this oxygen is then bonded to another molecule. And now it drops one negative charge, goes from -3 to -2, and it becomes an organic phosphate. These organic phosphates will break off, become inorganic phosphates within the system, then they'll bond back to molecules and become organic phosphates again. And that cycle goes over and over again throughout the body and the physiology. Now, some functions of phosphates within the body. Okay. So within the body, phosphates actually will form things like ATP. So ATP molecules are used for cellular energy. So adenosine triphosphate, so there's 3 phosphates that are attached to this. ATP is a structure called a nucleotide. We see nucleotides, not only ATP, but DNA and RNA. So we can see a nucleotide structure. So that's where you're gonna have a phosphate, a sugar, most often ribose, unless you're in DNA, then it's deoxyribose, and then a nitrogenous base. So we find them in there. So nucleotides have phosphates. These nucleotides, like ATP, can be used for energy. Nucleotides can be found in DNA, so genetic or genes. Then nucleotides are also found in RNA, and RNA is a copy of DNA to make a protein. So we can also see phosphates present in protein synthesis or carrying out gene expression. Now, the last thing I'll tell you about phosphates that we also see is these phosphates are alkaline substances. Okay? And alkaline means it's basic. So when we talk about basic, then we get into this whole idea of a pH scale. Now, when we looked at pH before, or if you've done that in other classes like biology or chemistry, the pH scale is 0 to 14. 7 is right in the middle, and that is neutral. We say any pH that is less than 7 is acidic. Okay? A pH that is greater than 7 is basic. Now, another word for basic would be alkaline. Okay. Now, when we start talking physiology and chemistry of the body, we generally refer to blood chemistry and blood physiology. And the reason for that is, one, the circulation in the blood reach all the tissues in the body and supply it with nutrients and remove waste from it. The convenient thing about that is it's easy to do a blood draw, a CBC, right from the vein in our arm and look at the blood chemistry. If we're talking about phosphate content in the body, we generally are checking it through the blood chemistry, through a simple blood draw. We don't want to go into bones and be drawing out different minerals because, one, that's very invasive and painful. And if you draw it out of one bone, it doesn't necessarily tell you that mineral's deposition in another bone, okay? So we always look at these structures. Now we're looking at bone mineral homeostasis, but we also have to take into account how that's going to be in the blood, in the circulatory system. Now, the reason I bring this up is when we check pH of the body, there's different pH ranges within different parts of the body, like the stomach, the bladder, places like that. But blood pH is what we generally consider the overall pH of the body. Now, human blood pH for a human is going to be 7.35 to 7.45. We usually say that the blood pH likes to hang around 7.4. So in this particular case, phosphates are stored within the bones, that's their reservoir. And if our blood pH drops below 7.4, what we will see is we will release hormones that will help break down bone tissue, releasing phosphates into our blood, elevating the blood phosphate level. And then since it's alkaline, if our blood pH drops below 7.4 towards 7.35, those increase of phosphates in the blood that are alkaline will help bring the blood pH back up closer to 7.4. Then we can shut off the release of phosphates from the bone and bone breakdown, or reabsorption, if you will, and then in that activity there. So this is the breakdown of phosphates within the bone mineral process, as well as how it relates to the blood chemistry. And then we're going to switch over to looking at calcium side of things. Now, blood calcium, if you look at that, or blood or bone calcium, calcium tends to get more of the attention than phosphates when we look at that as far as like the blood chemistry and its functions throughout the body. So let's talk calcium in the body. Now, calcium, when we look at this, its functions, or actually let's talk about where we get it first. So first off, we get calcium from our diets. So the food we eat is very important, okay? And then when we consume this calcium, the calcium then goes throughout our circulatory system in the blood. It's used for many different processes, but then it's also stored in the bones as a reservoir. So what foods in our diet are high in calcium? Dark leafy greens, those are the best. Now, a lot of times we've been told that dairy is full of calcium, which is true. The problem with that is there's this thing called bioavailability. Anytime you put a substance, say like dairy food, into your body, it's full of calcium, but the thing is bioavailability is how much of that mineral, meaning calcium, can you pull out of the dairy food and then absorb and actually use it within your body. Unfortunately, calcium coming from dairy foods doesn't have a high bioavailability. Does that make sense? So we're higher bioavailability in dark leafy greens like kale, spinach, things of that nature. If you're going to consume dairy foods for your calcium, you're better off with cultured dairy foods like yogurt, cottage cheese versus milk, just straight milk, okay? The downside to dairy foods is they are an animal product, and whole milk and cheeses and things like that are full of saturated fats. You can eat all the spinach you want and it's not full of saturated fat, so you can get calcium and not be loading your diet with saturated fat as well. Okay, so you consume calcium in your diet. If you don't have a diet that has got the sufficient enough amount of calcium, calcium is stored in the bones, so then it has to leach that calcium from the bones, and over time that will lead to a breakdown of bones and make weak bones. Now let's talk about the function of calcium in the body. We'll list a few here. So in here we get muscle contractions. So in this muscle contractions we have both skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle to contract uses calcium, obviously for movement and exercise to stay healthy. We have to use our skeletal muscles, so we have to have a sufficient amount of calcium to do that. The other type of muscle that we're concerned about is cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle has to continue its job so we can pump blood throughout the body and stay alive. That's very important. The other thing we're going to see in functions of calcium are going to be nerve impulse transmission. Now, nerve impulse travel, you can say transmission or even travel, if you will. So, or just plain nerve activity. Then the other thing we'll list in here that's important for functions of calcium is blood clotting. So there's a lot of important functions that calcium is required for in the body and to maintain proper physiology. So usually we say that really calcium is used for basically, for the most part, just about every physiological process in the body. So when we look at calcium, if we are going to increase blood calcium, we have to take it away from the bone. Or if we want to lower blood calcium, we have to store it in the bone. And to do this, there are 3 hormones that help us with this. So again, we can look at blood calcium levels versus taking out bone samples, we get a better idea of what kind of calcium's in the body. Now, before we move on to the hormones that regulate the calcium level, let's talk about blood calcium levels. The normal adult range for blood calcium is going to be 8.9 to 10.1 milligrams per deciliter of blood. And that's our normal range. Since we're talking about blood calcium and blood calcium levels, if you drop below 8.9, you have something called hypocalcemia. Hypo meaning below normal levels, cal for calcium, and then cemia, or that emia at the end, for blood. If you get a blood calcium level above 10.1, then you're dealing with hypercalcemia. So, now, that's calcium as it relates to the blood and the regular physiology of the body. Now let's talk about the three hormones that play the important role of balancing out calcium levels throughout the body.